Not sure why everyone's over here, not over here. Doesn't matter. I guess it's a little farther from the food. All right, so my name is Mike Shepard. I've been coming to this group for about 2 years, off and on. I didn't make it to the first meeting, but I think I was at the second one. It's been a while since I've been here, so I recognize some of you. I don't recognize a lot of you, but that's all right. I work for a company called Jack Henry. We're a banking software company, banking, credit union, ATMs, payments, anything in that space. I work in Springfield, Missouri, so I had a little bit of a drive to get here, so that's fun. I've been doing PowerShell for 11 years. I've been blogging for 9 years. My blog is PowerShellStation.com. Kind of slacked off lately, haven't been blogging as much. I also am very active on Stack Overflow. Pretty excited about that. I have had a couple of good months. I was in the top 2% this quarter, so that's nice. What else? I wrote a couple PowerShell books. So anyway, enough about me. I do a lot of database stuff. I do a lot of stuff with Visio. I do stuff with GUIs lately. Kind of been weird. I also do Octopus deploy stuff. That's kind of been my job for the last 8 months or so, is doing Octopus deploy with PowerShell and MSIs and backpacks and stuff like that. So that's kind of exciting and new for me. So today, though, I'm going to talk about PowerShell and GUIs. Anybody love GUIs in here? GUIs are nice, right? Do you boot into a command line, right, like you did in the old days? No, you don't do that anymore. And I am not going to actually do the presentation. I'm going to actually just leave it like this so I can switch back and forth easier without disrupting the video. So GUIs and PowerShell, right? PowerShell is the anti-GUI, right? It's the revolution at Microsoft that says we're not going to use GUIs anymore. We're going to use command line to do stuff, right? So they're exactly the opposite. And so if I'm using a GUI instead of PowerShell, in some sense, I'm admitting defeat. Do you ever feel that way? I completely understand. That is not my point. I completely disagree with that premise. I think that if your primary access to technology is through a GUI, then you're missing out. But if you have a GUI in front of PowerShell, then maybe you've got a good solution. And if you look in the Monad Manifesto, anybody ever read the Monad Manifesto in here? You should read it. Google that. Jeff Snover wrote that, I don't know, 2001, maybe probably earlier than that even. It's kind of where he lays out his vision for PowerShell, which the code name was Monad. There's a whole chapter in it that talks about GUI and how that should work. And some of what he lays out there is present in the ISE. Some of it isn't. Some of it, I don't know how well it would work. But still, the idea of GUI has been present in the vision for PowerShell from the beginning. And I'll make the slides available too if you want to read them. I don't like just reading slides to you. You probably don't want to listen to me read slides either. So where does it make sense to use a GUI in PowerShell? So do you ever have any users, not users, any admins who don't want to script? You know any admins that don't want to script? It drives me crazy. And like, just learn to script, please, just learn to script. But what you can do is you can build GUIs that run scripts. And then once you kind of, get the first one free like that, you get them hooked on what's happening. You can show them behind the scenes how much more powerful it is to use the scripts, how they can be more flexible and more powerful that way, how they can start scheduling things instead of having to dial in at midnight to click on the button that's just running a PowerShell script anyway. What about scripts that have lots of parameters, or have parameters that are really complex, right? Wouldn't it be nice sometimes to have a form to enter parameters on that maybe let you do something like select an SSL cert from a dropdown instead of typing the thumbprint, or copy and pasting, either way, right? But you can make a mistake when you copy and paste, can't you? A lot easier to take it from a dropdown. Similarly with a date, file, folder, right? All those kinds of things are easier to do if I can maybe use a GUI element that's appropriate to put the data in. Now, again, I want to emphasize that I hope that what that's doing is calling a PowerShell script, because I really, really want to be using PowerShell behind the scenes to do all of the automation that I'm doing. I just like to use GUIs sometimes as a front end to that to make it a little bit easier. I also mentioned data entry, right? It's just more consistent that way. I also mentioned interactive or graphical console. I will show you kind of a proof of concept along those lines that I've been working on lately. It's kind of towards the end, and it's kind of halfway broken, so bear with me. I gave this talk in Springfield in December, and it didn't exist at that point, and I had to just kind of explain my vision for it. So you'll at least get to see it. So what about just using the ISE, right? The ISE is a GUI, right? The graphical user interface. It's got menus. You use the mouse to click around, and you can right-click on things, and right? It's a GUI. It's not probably what you think of when you say GUI, but it is a GUI. So what kinds of things can you do in the ISE? Well, you've got the command add-in, right? The command add-in is a perfect example of a GUI for PowerShell. I'll also tell you that the first thing I do when I log on a new box, if I have to RDP into it, if I open up ISE, the first thing I do is close it because I don't use it, but I love it. I really think it's a great idea. The idea of it is I can find whatever commandlets are installed on the machine, and it's going to visualize each of the parameter sets, right? Parameter sets are kind of distinct use cases for commandlets. There are different ways you can use a commandlet. It gives you a tab for each of those, gives you different controls for different parameter types. So if it's a switch, it gives you a checkbox. If it's got a validate set on it, it's going to give you a drop-down, let you choose values like that. And then it will either let you run the command that corresponds to the parameters you put in, or you can just copy it into the editor. So it's a nice, simple, fairly simple. I'd hate to write it. It wouldn't be a lot of fun to write. But it's a simple GUI. Also, there's other GUIs inside the ISE. There's the script analyzer, module browser. Did you ever use those? I think script analyzer is pretty good. I haven't used the module browser other than loading it at one point. There's more stuff you can do in the ISE, and this stuff it actually excites me quite a bit more than the command add-in, and that is where I can actually interact with the object model of the ISE, right? I've got some script up there that isn't very exciting. It adds some menu items to the ISE. It does it in PowerShell. Now, obviously, it's not very exciting to add a menu to the ISE, but the idea of having a script modify the program that's running the script, to me, is pretty exciting. Or just to even interact with the object model of the program that's running the script is pretty exciting, right? You have to kind of squint to see it, but PowerShell is being a macro language to control the ISE at that point, right? It's quite a bit more than that, but that's how we're using it there. And you can do the same thing in your own .NET app. You can embed the PowerShell engine and take elements from your object model and expose it to the engine and then run scripts that modify your application while it's running, which is pretty neat. So you have access to some of the inner workings like tabs, like editor tabs, menus, colors. There's a function that the ISE defines called PSEdit that lets you open files in the ISE, only from inside the ISE though, so that's fun. And I've got a link to the object model documentation, which honestly I don't know that I've ever looked at. I found it, I was looking at PSEdit and found that and went, that's interesting. I didn't know that was documented, which that shouldn't surprise me that it's documented, but I'd never stumbled upon it. There's more inside the ISE, right? The ISE is a graphical host. Just like the console is a text-based host, the ISE is a graphical host. So it gives you some of its functionality in graphical ways. So if I use get credential from inside the ISE, I'm going to get a credential pop-up box. I'm not going to get, you know, please enter username prompt in the output text, right? It's going to give me a graphical way to do that, which is pretty nice. It's nicer than doing it in the text console, I think. Similarly, progress output is going to be an actual progress bar instead of just ASCII art. And confirm prompts, again, are going to be pop-ups. So that, you're probably thinking, that's not really GUI, but it is, right? I'm using PowerShell, and I'm getting user interaction using the mouse and the keyboard as opposed to what you would get in the text console. So I think that's it's easy to overlook, but it's something that's there. By the way, if you have questions at any point, please interrupt me. I'm much more interested in you guys learning this than having a polished start to finish presentation. Okay, so if you have any questions about anything, just yell or throw something.
I just have a couple.
Okay, yes.
So I just wanted to point out for those of you who are using VS Code that a lot of those things have been ported over there. I think PSEdit inside of VS Code should open the file still, those types of things.
I think it does. I think they've got an alias.
There's also a really cool extension for the ISE if you're committed to using that instead that allows you to start remote sessions and edit files over them, like kind of natively. So I can't remember what the shortcut is, but it's like Control R and some other key function, and then it'll prompt you for where you want to connect to, and then you can choose the file you want to open over there.
Okay. Is that one of
Jeff Hicks?
I was going to say Jeff Hicks, yeah. I thought he did that.
I think it's new remote ISE tab or something like that.
Okay. That's cool. Yeah, that's good. And I'll just tell you, I like VS Code. I do. I don't love it. I want to. Every time I go to use it, it breaks, and I switch back to ISE. So what I end up doing, I hate it, but I've got my folder open in VS Code. I check it out from GitHub. I do my stuff for a little bit until it breaks, and then I open it up over here and I check it back in. So I'm using it like a source control app.
Do you file an issue every time something breaks?
No, I'm bad. I know.
Shame.
And it's mostly debugging, and it's probably me, but
problem, Mike, you just don't debug and it's fine. Just run it in prod and it'll be okay.
Yeah, that's it.
That's your debug.
That's what I need to do. Actually, most of the stuff I do doesn't have a prod. Most of it's just a tool, so there's no production. So, but yeah, that's a good point. A lot of the stuff that I'm talking about in ISE, you have the same kind of functionality in VS Code. I haven't played around with much of it in VS Code, but it is there. So the simplest GUI that you'll ever use, other than the ones that are built in, is Grid View. And when I teach a class, and I used to put this at the end, you know, after all of the hard stuff, I would be like, yeah, here's how you really should start. And I'm like, that's stupid. So how many of you know about Grid View? Half-ish, 60%. So Grid View is amazing. So if I say dir pipe to, let me make that a little bigger. Grid View. I've got an enter key, believe it or not. It works. All right. So what it does is it takes the output, takes the objects, and it looks at the default view or how you've got it formatted and sticks those objects into a grid view. And then I can sit here and sort and filter this grid view, right? Click on the column headers. I can add criteria if I want. Length is, they're all strings, so it's not going to work. But we'll say length is not empty, right? So then all of the folders disappeared. So anyway, this is a pretty simple GUI, right? I did absolutely zero work, and I have something that a user who isn't particularly script savvy could look at and interact with. Probably wouldn't use a directory listing. Probably it's going to be whatever objects the users are interested in, but I could put them in front of them and they could see the things and deal with them. Okay, so this is the first way you use Grid View, just to say, here's some stuff. And they say, thank you, and they're done. And that's all nice, but there's an even better way to use Grid View, and that is to use it as an interactive where object, right? If I use the same command and just put a pass-through on the end, it looks almost exactly the same. The only difference is down here in the corner, I've got an OK and cancel, right? And the default is multi-select. I can change that using some switches or parameters on Grid View. But then I can select things and say, OK, I've selected the ones I want, and then it's going to output the objects that I selected. Okay? So you could say, pick which report you want to run. Oh, I want to run the report on this input file. Great. And then take the output of the command and process it just like you would. I can use this in a pipeline. It's going to output the same objects that came in, right? The same, real objects. It's not fiddling with the objects anyway. Does that make sense? Is that pretty cool? Grid View? It is super useful. Yes. Oh, yeah. So if you think of a file object or a folder object, think there's 100 properties on it, right? But when I did that, it looked kind of like formatted output, right? Not very easily. That would be actually very hard to do. I wish I could think of a good way to do it. I could maybe, doing formatting on the fly is hard. Doing type-based formatting on the fly is kind of hard. So you'd have to specify a specific view, and then you're formatting, and then you lose the data. So you can use select object to pipe it into this to get, but then it doesn't survive. So what I would do then is I would keep the objects in a collection, right? Then I would use select object, pipe it into Grid View with pass-through, and make sure that I've got some key value, right, that I can reference back to the collection, right? And then just get the ones that match. Right? It's a little more work, but you can make it work. But it isn't built into Grid View. You don't have anything nice like that built in. Good question, though. I like it. What you're thinking. Other questions? So Grid View should always be, if you're thinking, I need to build a GUI, it should always be the first thing you go to because it's so stinking easy. You don't have to write any code unless you're doing what he's doing. And then you got to write a little code. But you're not writing GUI code, right? Anybody write GUI code very much? Horrible to write. I hate it, which is funny because that's what I'm talking about today. But what you'll find is when I talk about how to do something, usually I'm talking about how to get out of doing something, how to make PowerShell do it for you. So that's where we're going to go. So there are also pre-made dialogues, right? If all I need to do is have the user pick a file, I can use the open file dialog from Windows Forms. I got to write a little bit of code. Got it down here, right? Using the using keyword now in PowerShell to import this namespace, right? Then I get an open file dialog. I tell it where to start. I give it a filter. I show it. It's pretty simple code. Embed that in a function somewhere, and then I've got a file picker that's reusable, right? So that's nice. And it's not just the file open. There's a save file dialog, folder browser, fonts, printers, a lot of basic stuff like that. So this is still pretty easy, still pretty good. And I found out just recently that one of the major issues with Windows Forms, you know how it doesn't work well with high DPI stuff? They fixed most of that in November. So they actually adjusted, not everything, but it's better than it was. So one of the reasons that people moved to WPF.
Hey, Mike.
Question? Yes.
Do you know when they added the using namespace?
PowerShell 5.
PowerShell 5?
Yeah.
Okay.
And I'm torn on it, honestly. I don't generally criticize the PowerShell team because I think they're amazing. They do awesome stuff. And I tell people if the PowerShell team does something that you don't like, it's not because it's bad, it's because you don't understand what they're doing, usually. I don't like having 3 ways to get a module in, right? Using requires, using, or using import module. That bothers me, but it's all good.
Does this do any better about reloading an assembly if it happens to change the net to?
No,
Okay.
it's in the.
It's still .NET.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
part of
Once it's loaded, you're done. Okay. Thanks, Mike.
Good question. What's next? There's also an input box. Using it is a little bit different, but still the same idea, right? It's just a way to ask somebody a question with a text value. Again, this is to keep you from writing UI code, right? Because as administrators writing automation, you don't want to spend time writing UI code, right? You don't want to do that. So what if none of the pre-made stuff works, right? You say, I need more than just a file open dialog. I need more than to ask the user one text value. I actually need a GUI. So you can write brute force .NET Windows Forms. And this is a very small snippet of Forms code. And I'll just tell you, I didn't write this code because I don't write brute force PowerShell .NET Forms. I actually work with a guy who wrote a UI that's actually on the machine I'm using. And it's all the way across the company. And I showed him how to do stuff that wasn't brute force after he wrote it. He was a little bit mad because he wrote this whole UI and he did all of it completely by hand. And he did a good job. He did a really, really good job, but there's a lot of work. So there's no magic here. .NET, the Windows Forms is .NET. I can access .NET objects, and I use them. One nice thing is if I'm doing events, I can pass it a script block, and PowerShell does some magic to make that work. I don't want to think about that magic, but it's there. So anybody think this looks like a fun thing to do? You're lying. Don't want to do that. So, yes. How does what happen? I lost something there. It's exactly the same thing, right? The host, the PowerShell host, which is either ISE or the console, is a .NET application using the .NET runtime, hosting the PowerShell engine. When you create a .NET object, it's the exact same garbage collection happening there. Yeah. And sometimes you interact with it. Sometimes you've got something that's using a lot of memory and you bad and just tell it collect. But anyway, but yeah, it's exactly the same thing that would be in a .NET app. And just like in a normal .NET app, you generally don't have to do anything with it. It just happens.
Hey, Mike. Oh, wow, sorry. Have you ever done the other brute force method?
Which?
XAML.
Yeah, you're
okay.
You're getting ahead. Getting ahead.
Sorry.
Yeah, it's all right. I have done XAML brute force. I've done XAML lots of different ways, and it's worse than forms. It is. It just is. So poshgui.com. So say you don't want to write a GUI by hand, which you don't, but you need a GUI. What you do is you go to poshgui.com. I have actually, see if it remembers that I've logged in. Clicked. Okay, well, let's do it. Go to the GUI editor. Clicking and nothing's happening.
If only our internet worked for you.
Oh, there we go. So this is a free website. You don't have to have you don't have to log into it or anything, and you can go in here just like you would use, a forms editor in Visual Studio, right? I can say there's a button, there's a text box, there's a label, right? I can name the things. The button is called. So I can't type. You'll know I cannot type. There's just a G there that won't go away. Whatever, it's called Go. This is called text box. The text of this is name. And then on the button, it has text of Go. And we want an event for a click. And it is called button. Right, now I can I can look at the code. There we go. Copy, there we go. I can copy that and paste it into here. And there's all this kind of code. And you can tell it looks suspiciously like the code I had on the brute force slide because that's how I did it, because I'm not willing to brute force it. But you see it's pretty easy to use. And then here's this button click that I told it to do. So I can say function, button, click. I won't even put parameters in here. And I'll just say write output text box dot text. And if I run this, there's my form. Can't even type my name. That's awesome. Nothing happens when I click that, so that's awesome. Don't know why it didn't output that. Anyway, the idea is there I've got a GUI that I can interact with.
You should write pester tests to verify if your GUI is going to work.
What's that?
I said you should write pester tests and then verify those while you're developing. You have to do TDD.
You should write pester tests for everything, but you don't.
You don't know.
You can smack him, Mike. It's okay.
Don't worry. So I highly recommend using Posh GUI if you've got to generate a user interface using forms. It's a pretty nice way to do it. There's a lot of new stuff on there. You can say there's a repository. So you can save things and fork projects and stuff. So it's pretty neat. The tool is about a year old, but he revamped it in the last week or two. All right, Sapien is a maker of tools. They have a tool called PowerShell Studio, which is a really, really nice full-featured IDE for PowerShell. It also includes a forms editor. They also had, for a long time, it has been discontinued for a long time, a tool called PowerShell Primal Forms Community Edition, which was simply a forms editor. They don't distribute that anymore. So, but it was a nice forms editor, but it was a one-way thing. So you would generate your form, and you would tell it, give me the PowerShell. Once you've got that PowerShell, obviously you would fiddle with it. You would add event handling and stuff like that. You could never get that back into the tool to continue to work on the interface. So if you're using PowerShell Studio, you can do that kind of two-way development, which is really, really nice.
Just another point in favor of PowerShell Studio, it also has like built-in checks for like your help and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah. By no means is this the only feature. It has all of the features you would expect in an IDE. I don't use it. I know some people who do though, where they use it and really like it. So I recommend. And these tools aren't expensive, right? If you think about how much time it would take you to build a nice GUI, even if it's $250, $300, that's not really that much time. When it talks it. On the other hand, and I don't have any slides to talk about this, but if you're writing a really complex, intricate user interface, don't do it in PowerShell. Really, use C# or heaven forbid Visual Basic. Use a language that's.
There's a pretty good abandoned project out there. I don't know if it's been picked back up or anything, but I think it's called Launchpad. So it let you do your front end in HTML and then call PowerShell behind the scenes. Essentially, you're hosting PowerShell with your website, and so then you'd use that to hook in and do all the calls and stuff. But you could do all your front level presentation stuff in HTML, CSS.
Okay. I haven't seen that.
I'll see if I can dig it up.
Yeah, I would like to see that. I enjoy looking at things like that. All right. There's also, if you have Visual Studio, then this includes the Community Edition. There is a tool from Adam Driscoll called Pro Tools. This is the commercial, the for pay edition of it. It has a PowerShell Forms editor as well. That's hosted inside Visual Studio. So it's in the standard Visual Studio Forms editor, but it outputs PowerShell. So that's a pretty nice feature. I would show it to you, but I haven't paid for it and my trial expired. So you don't get to see it. Also, as a bonus, it has a WPF designer that's in beta. So that's exciting. So I can write WPF in PowerShell. The not so bonus is that I couldn't get it to work. So, and Adam couldn't get it to work either. She said I was the only one having this problem, so I certainly don't blame him for not spending a ton of time working on it. But so with that, kind of segue into WPF. How many people use WPF at all? Anybody? Do you use WPF? So WPF is a much more modern, it's not super new. It's what, 15 years old probably. It's a different way of writing user interfaces. It kind of emphasizes separation of presentation and logic. So you build your presentation in something called XAML, which is an XML-based description language. It looks kind of like HTML, reminiscent of that. And then, you can add event handlers, stuff like that to it. Generally speaking, usually when people talk about doing XAML in PowerShell, what they say is, so you open up Visual Studio and you use your XAML editor and you build your interface, and then you take the XAML file and then you open that from PowerShell. And you can do that, and I've got actual code sample in the slide here. ISE, so you can see it. So here is some XAML. I just have it stored as a string, so I don't have to worry about keeping a file and the presentation in the same place, but it'd be the same thing if I read it from a file. So here I'm using this. I add the presentation framework, which is WPF. I read the XML from the XAML string. I load the window. Then I can actually locate controls based on the names. So here is a control with a text box. It's got a name attribute. So I can find things by attribute. And then I can add events to those. And again, the events, I can actually just add a script block referencing the controls. So let me run this. Again, this is not exciting at all. I say Mike, and then I click the checkbox to personalize the title. Now it says hello Mike in the title. So completely not exciting at all. But the idea is that I've built a user interface. I'm loading it in PowerShell. I'm actually manipulating the interface somehow in PowerShell. Okay, so, and there's not a lot of code involved. So that's pretty nice. That makes sense? Still not a lot of fun, right? I would certainly not want to write this by hand, though. Right? This would be worse to write by hand than the form stuff. I think a lot worse. But a lot of that, I'll admit, a lot of it is because I'm not as good with WPF. I don't know it as well as I do forms. So XAML files, finding name controls, event handlers. It's pretty slick. That's a good bullet point there. You can use Visual Studio to edit the XAML if you want to. Save the XAML file, pretty easy. Pro Tools, I mentioned, has a beta WPF XAML designer. So I can do WPF in PowerShell without a XAML file using the Windows Presentation Foundation classes directly. And I should have some code just to show you how to do that in a pretty generic way, but instead I'm going to skip ahead because I didn't enjoy doing it. So this is mostly a talk I gave in December back in Springfield. And at that point, I had 3 projects that I was thinking about working on. So that's what the end of the presentation is, the 3 projects that I was planning on working on. In the 3 months, I've worked on them and have stuff to show you. So one of the reasons that you do GUIs in PowerShell is to do data entry, right? So I thought, why isn't it easier to do data entry in PowerShell than it is? And I thought, well, why don't I just make it easy? So I wrote a DSL, so I wrote a domain-specific language. Everybody know what a domain-specific language is? Right, the idea is it's commands that use terms from the subject matter that I'm writing code about so that it kind of hides the fact that I'm writing code. That makes sense?
A good example people may have read is DSC.
Yeah.
DSC is a DSL, so is Pester.
Yeah, right. If you look at DSC code, it doesn't, for the most part, look like PowerShell code, even though it is every bit of it's PowerShell. Same thing with Pester, right? If I look at a Pester test, it doesn't look like PowerShell code. Little pieces of it might look like PowerShell code, but in general, it doesn't look like PowerShell code. So I wrote a DSL that covers a small bit of WPF, right? Not all of it by any means, and it's still a work in progress. So there may be some red text on the screen at some point. But the idea is All right, I want a window, and in the window I want a text box named Fred with text of hello world, another text box named Barney, right? Just describing a UI in a very abstract kind of way. This doesn't look like PowerShell, does it? It is. I mean, obviously, I wouldn't be telling you if it wasn't. But the point is, it doesn't look like programming. Right here, I'm describing something to you. But it turns out, let me just copy that code. I still have that WPF running. So I'll copy that over here. And I'm going to just run this. And it blew up, so that was nice. Yeah, I don't know what I blew up. Let me make one change to it. I didn't try. There we go. Okay. So here is the same thing using Dialog instead of window. I tend to use Dialog instead of window. Window basically just says, I'm telling you all of the controls that go in here, right? I'm giving you all of the interface. Dialog says, I'm going to tell you some controls, but go ahead and add an OK and cancel at the bottom and handle output. So there's something wrong with the window function, and that's because, like I said, I haven't tested it very much. So here you can see I've got a text box labeled Fred with text of hello world, another one labeled Barney. And let me edit the text here so you can see that something's happening. If I click OK, it outputs the data that I entered, and it has fields. It gives me an object, and the fields in the object are the things, the names of the controls. So does that look useful? Halfway useful? I've written date pickers and file pickers, and I say wrote. There's almost nothing to writing a control in this, right? You just tell it, I want a new WPF control called this, and here's how you put a value in it, here's how you get a value out of it. In fact, let me just show you so you know that I'm not doing anything completely wild. I don't want you to think that I'm writing crazy stuff. That is not where I needed to go. Windows PowerShell. That's for later. That's project number 3. So here is, so for instance, here is a text box. Right, and all I do is, you can also pass it in a hash table of other properties to set, and it sets a bunch of properties, gives you a control. It puts it adds a script method to the object called getControlValue, so that at the end, when you click OK, I don't have to look at the object to figure out how to get the value out of it. The control knows how to get its own value. Makes things a lot easier to wrap up. But that's it, and then it outputs the object. So that's pretty much how this thing is written. This is up on my GitHub, which Mike Shepard, it's been up there for a month or so. And I'm committing to it every few days, every week, something like that. So that's a fun little project for doing data entry forms. You can do a little bit of complexity in it, right? I can use a stack panel. I can nest stack panels, which give you nested objects out, which is a little bit weird. I'm not sure how good that is, how robust it is, but it's at least an option. So that was my first project. Was I really should be able to do data entry forms easily, right? If that's the #1 use for doing GUIs and PowerShell, that ought to be something that we can take care of, and it is. It's pretty easy to do with that. The second thing is, what if I have an object, right? And I want to give the user the ability to interact with some of the object. I want to give the user the ability to edit pieces of the object. So I wrote something to do that as well. In fact, here is some example of that. And obviously, this just piggybacks on the WPF DSL. So here I have a custom object with 3 properties, an int, a string, and a date time. And I tell it I want to edit the object. Updates should be passed through. I haven't, that's not right, but it works. Yeah, notice I'm not assigning it back to F. If I assign it back to F, that would be passed through. What I'm actually taking the object that you pass in, I'm actually updating it directly. So that's kind of fun. Anyway, here's how it works. Again, it's just building an interface. Right, there's a date picker. 5. Okay, and now if I look at F, it output the object as well. But if I look at the original object, it's also been updated. So I think that's kind of cool, interesting, and it's this much code again. So think that is kind of cool at all? I think it's kind of cool. Yeah. Think it's cool. Okay. You're supporting me. I appreciate that. All right. The next project is the one that's a little more out there. You have to kind of bear with me. So this is something that I actually wrote this project 10 years ago, 11 years ago, something like that, probably 2007. But I wrote it really badly in terms of software engineering badly, right? I cobbled it together over time and hacked it together and didn't put any thought into how it was structured, and it's written terribly, and I hate to look at the source code. On the other hand, there's a team that uses it every day and does most of their tasks with it. So I'm excited by that. And they don't have bug reports. They don't ever ask me to fix anything. So so the idea is, think of the ISE crossed with SQL Management Studio, right? Or think of SQL Management Studio with a PowerShell console instead of SQL, right? And instead of databases in the tree over to the left, whatever you want in the tree to the left. Okay? What objects do you deal with? What kinds of objects do you deal with? Anybody?
Servers. Servers.
Right. So maybe you have you know a tree that has different data centers and different business units in the data centers, right? And inside each of those, you might have a few key servers that you deal with. And if you right-click on one of those servers, what are the actions that you do with that server? Right? Obviously, that would be one thing. Maybe there's a service that dies every now and then, and you haven't tracked down why, and you just have to make sure that service is running, right? It would be nice to just be able to click on it and say, run that service, or restart the server, or whatever. So the idea here is that I don't know what workload you have, and there probably is a console for doing some of what you do. Maybe it's MMC, maybe it's a custom console from some vendor, right? But you probably don't just have one kind of thing that you do. You probably have lots of things. When I wrote this, I was a PeopleSoft administrator. Anybody love PeopleSoft? Anybody ever administer PeopleSoft? No? Well, one of the great things about administering PeopleSoft is they don't give you any administrative tools whatsoever. We had command line tools, and that was it. And they were command line tools local on a server. So when I went to do maintenance on our production CRM instance, it was 27 boxes, and I had to RDP into 27 boxes, open up consoles, choose option 1, choose option 3. Yeah, it wasn't a real good situation during a maintenance window, right? Because, I mean, the whole point of automation is that anytime you do something repetitively, you're going to screw it up. So during a maintenance window, screwing it up means I left an app server running. I tried to update the database. Now I'm in a really bad state. So I wrote a tool to automate all those kinds of things. So in our environment, I had a tree that had every kind of PeopleSoft application, and under that, every PeopleSoft environment for that application, and under that, app servers, web servers, batch servers, database servers, and I could click anywhere and do any operation. I could click on the environment and say stop, and it would issue a stop on all the nodes, right? So I built my own MMC, if you will, and they still use it to this day. The same tool. They update it all the time. They add new stuff. But the idea here is that like I said, I don't know what you do. I don't want to know what you do necessarily. I don't mean that in a bad way. I shouldn't have to know what you do. You know what you do. You write scripts to manage what you do. What this does is it lets you visualize that and lets you automate it from a GUI perspective. I'll show you here in a second. It won't be a very good demo because it's broken, but oh, that's the last slide. So let me open Visual Studio. This is a C# app too, by the way. It's not written in PowerShell. Like I said, if you're writing a complex GUI, don't do it in PowerShell. I highly recommend using almost anything else. You could do it in PowerShell. There's no technical reason not to. Don't get me wrong. Multi-threading is a little bit rough in PowerShell. Start using posh RSJob and stuff like that, and you can make it work. But I'm gonna just run this. And I think I've got a default workload in here that is the operational validation framework. Anybody know what OVF is? Everyone knows what pester testing is, right? You know what pester is for doing writing tests in PowerShell. Started out, at least conceptually, as a unit testing framework, but people use it to test anything from unit testing all the way up to infrastructure testing, and it's a great tool. One, it's not an issue, but something that OVF ships with PowerShell 5.1, Server 2016. OVF basically says, if you put your pester tests in the right place in a module, I'll know where they are, and I'll be able to run them without you pointing me directly to a script. So you can say, run all the operational validation tests that are on this box, or run the tests that are associated with this module, which can be broken down into simple and comprehensive tests. So you can say, run all the simple tests on this box, right? So the idea there is that if I install a bunch of software on a box and I want it to know if it's running, I write tests and put them in modules, and then I can just say, run all the tests, and I get red, green on whatever components that are on the box. So that's the idea there. So this is my terrible UI. You can see it fairly well. I have a couple of trees. Here's a tree that I built from OVF. I used an OVF command that says, show me all of the OVF tests that are on the box. I built a tree view out of that, and it shows you the modules and then simple and comprehensive tests for each of those. And then for one of these, I can right-click, and I can execute that test. And I've got a breakpoint because I was debugging. Video, it's thinking, and I haven't made it use a wait cursor or anything like that. It will eventually output something down here, at least it should. Demo gods are not smiling on me. There it is, okay. It did actually work. Why it took so long, I don't know. Let me run another one. And it ran a lot faster. So there you see, I'm interacting again with the user interface. These menus are built with code, and I'm running script based on objects in the user interface. Does that make sense what I'm talking about? And you see, right? The application doesn't know anything about OVF, right? There's no OVF built into this C# application. Show you, file open doesn't exist in the app yet, so I actually have to do it this way. So here is, open a new ISE. Here is the OVF code. So I add some menu items to different kinds of things. And that's one of the mechanisms here, is that you assign menu items to types. And when you click on something, it looks at the type of the object. And then figures out what menus are associated with that type of object and presents you a menu. That makes sense, I think. The nice thing about that is that I can assign menus to system.object and then everything gets them, right? So I'm actually looking at the whole type hierarchy for an object when I construct a menu. So here I say OVF test file has 2 menu items named execute. I don't like how I'm doing script there, but I've reworked it 3 or 4 times. Not quite where I want it to be. But the idea is I'm going to take whatever is pipe, whatever you click on, I'm going to pipe it into a for each invoke operation validation using whatever file path it is, right? It's just PowerShell script. And that doesn't actually work. The OVF module flips the progress bar. So I have that turned off because I didn't want to see it. I use get operation validation to get a list of all the test files on the machine. Then I loop through them and I add items to the tree based on where they are, what kind of thing it is. Okay, so these commandlets, add tree view item, add type menu item, those are commandlets that are actually part of the solution. They're written in C# and they interact with the user interface. That makes sense? This makes sense at all what I'm doing? Little. The idea though is whatever kind of objects you would have a script that loads those into a tree, right? You would also I should tell you, when I load stuff into a tree, I actually let you specify what kind of object it is. Right? I actually give you a way to override the type. That way it makes it easier. You don't have to actually look to see what kind of object this operation validation framework outputs. It's probably just a hash table, or actually I don't know what it outputs. This way I can specify types on things that don't even, I mean, I can just take a string and tell it, oh, it's this other type of thing. So when I click on it, I guess that's a special kind of menu. I'm rambling, I can tell. The idea, though, is that if I have script that knows how to manipulate certain kinds of objects, I can write other scripts to load those in a tree and associate the automation with the object so that I can click on it and make it happen, right? I used this when I was doing PeopleSoft administration, so that when we brought someone new on the team, I didn't have to teach them everything, right? They could go into the environment and start and stop services, I should say, not servers. They could start and stop services without me having to do a whole lot of training. If somebody was on call and all they needed to do, oh, the batch server stopped working, they could go in and right-click on it and try to start it. And if it didn't work, they called somebody, but at least they had a chance to do good stuff. Question?
So given what you've got here is this application, and only because I'm trying to associate it to understand it, if I had, for say, I've got a whole ton of VMs, right? I've got different domains in UCS, in VMware, or whatever it may be, and I've got the ability to have dev, test, prod, and I can get back my servers for dev, and I get that list of servers for dev, and maybe there's functions that I can do specifically for dev that I cannot do for test or prod, again, change control, whatever it may be. I could get that list of VMs from VMware, load those VMs into an object array, load that into this application that gives me a tree of objects that I could potentially execute things off of. And I guess that's the next step, right? Is how do I execute? So this loads the items, right, in that left-hand tree. So then what you said, I can run tests, but then how do I also say, well, this is a dev server, therefore, I'll, load the dev actions.
So when you put it in the tree, you can tell it what type, you can give it a type, and it just inserts that string into the type list of the object. It doesn't fiddle with the object any. And all it does is it gives you a handle to use to attach actions to that. A lot of what we did in the original app, we loaded stuff out of the database. So the objects we had were almost always just data rows, right? But we would take the data row and say, this data row is an app server. So that when you click on it, you get app server actions. So yeah, that's exactly what you would do.
So then you can attach an action to a type, to a tag, basically.
Absolutely.
And then once you assign
here at the top.
those actions, okay.
So here, for instance, this line is what's adding the innermost node, which is actually pointing to a test file, right? A test script. So I've told it that's an OVF test file. Up here, I've got two different add type menu item calls. That the type is OVF test file.
So you can basically execute any PowerShell script with this by naming a test. So you could have OVF RDP, and you could initiate an RDP session.
Yeah, in fact,
remote PowerShell.
I started to write a bigger demo that kind of gave you, the multiple things on the same pane of glass where you had, maybe OVF at the top, maybe you had some VMs, maybe some Docker containers, right? And when you right-click on a Docker container, you can tell it start, stop, whatever. That makes sense? And gets it.
That's all that matters.
Yeah. 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 One of the things that we did was one of the tasks we had was refreshing a development environment from a production environment, right? Which sounds real easy. What do? You back to the database and you restore it, right? Except the security is in the database, right? So I've got to somehow extract that out and put it back in, and got to clear the cache, got to start the servers. It was a 32-step process, right? And it was a very manual process. It took about a half a day to do it. We did it in PowerShell. I scripted the whole thing out in PowerShell, and it was 2 commands. And the only parameter you pass it was the name of the target environment, as it always just did it from prod. And one guy using the interface, which isn't this interface, but it's essentially this, he did 8 refreshes in a morning. And you got them all right. And he wasn't a PeopleSoft administrator either. So, that's really about automation, less about the tool, but still. You could install it locally. It just really depends on where you can get to the things you need to get to. So, if I can't operate on my business items from my desktop, then there's no point running it on my desktop. Now, I will tell you that there's no reason that this thing, not this thing, but the other thing, can't be hosting a remote run space, right? I could open a run space on a remote machine and give you an interface to it. Just like in ISE, I can say, give me a remote PowerShell tab, right? I could do the same thing in code on the other thing so that I can be on my desktop and interact with objects somewhere else. Obviously, then you have double hop kind of issues, but possibility, right? And you could use GIA kind of stuff too with that, connect to a constrained endpoint. Lots of good options.
One other quick question. Are these commands that you have here, are these, because I don't know much about OVF, is that command, it looks like those are actually executed remotely?
The only thing on here that is OVF is get operation validation on line 14, that's OVF. Okay. And in the actions, this invoke operation validation, right, those are OVF. That's it.
So the invoke pester, is that on a, that executing that remotely on that machine?
No, this is all on my local machine.
Local? Okay.
Yeah. I don't have any remote stuff, but there's nothing keeping you from, because it's just PowerShell, right? This is the app that's running here is essentially the ISE, right? If I do the IR, I get output. It's just like the ISE. That make sense?
Yeah. I didn't know if you loaded nodes on the left that were your servers, if it would be intelligent enough to go execute the command or the actions you have on the server.
If you wrote the menu items to do it that way,
Then yes.
You could. It's all in your hands. That's the great thing about it, is that the app doesn't know anything about anything. It doesn't know how your business works, how your operational procedures are, right? If you need to use remoting to get to your stuff, great, build it in.
So I have a small suggestion for you.
Yeah.
Combine your first project with this project. Write a little DSL for doing commands, certain common runtime commands with this would be kind of neat.
I'm not averse to that. I don't know exactly how it would look, and I'll just tell you that I've only written about 1,000 of those menu items, and I don't know what the pattern is. I don't know a good DSL for that really. So essentially, what the pattern is supposed to be, I think I've decided on. I haven't rewritten it to do this. It should look like I have a script block with a parameter called object, and whatever is in the body of the function, that should be what's in the action. It's not quite what's in the action right now, but that should be what's there. Right now it's a string. It should be a script block. Makes more sense to be a script block because then you get to use tab completion and things are colored nicely. And anyway, that's about all I can think of to talk about GUIs. It's a lot. Questions do you have? Any questions at all? I have not posted this anywhere because it still feels broken in a lot of ways. Another thing that you can't really tell is that, so this is Windows Forms, this interface. I've written it so that there's an interface layer so that you could do the same thing in WPF, but my WPF skills are so bad that just getting the basic UI stuff to work, not any of the integration with PowerShell, just getting the UI to look right, I had too much trouble with that, so I just kind of unloaded that project. But the idea is I want you to be able to use either one. So I will definitely have it out on GitHub.
This comes up anytime somebody says that, but I got advice a long time ago, which was go ahead and post it publicly early, right? Because somebody will find this interesting, take a peek, and fix something for you, or point out a bug that you didn't notice or whatever.
Yeah, yeah. I need
also,
to post it and then write about it. I think that would be kind of the trick. Actually, if you followed my blog back in 2010 or so, I actually lined out quite a bit of this back then. Not to this extent, but I think I had 3 views with menus in my blog.
If you put it on GitHub this week, I will write some docs for it.
Okay.
And one of the other things too, Mike, right now you have it as a string, but if you do convert it to a script block, you could just as easily have that be a file to load a script from file, something like that, or a module written in a certain way where there's a function like a start function that,
Yeah, and there's a lot of
like
stuff that is, I mean, there's so much missing from this app. Like I said, I can't open a file at this point. So things like, what does a profile look like here, right? There should be a profile script, should follow the naming standards for profiles. There should be a way to mark a module as being associated with this, right? Maybe there's a way to in the manifest, say what host it will run in. I should be able to enumerate the modules on the system and see if any of them use this host and just load them so that you have the menus associated with, with those. There's a lot of stuff like that, but you're right. I do need to just get it out there and share. This is exciting to me. This is probably 1,000 lines of code, maybe. The other one that I wrote is probably 10,000 lines of code, and it doesn't do an awful lot more than this. So pretty excited that this is working. That's all I got. Questions, comments, thoughts? I think we're done, Ken.
Thank you for those of us who joined us remotely. I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording, and we'll post it online.